Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Gimel discusses the minimum size, length, and width of a sukkah. The Gemara will have three opinions. One is clear, that's Rebbe. The other two is Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. It's not clear if they're arguing over the size or if they're arguing over a specific case and whether a person is Yotzei the mitzvah as far as how he set himself up in the sukkah. The Gemara will clarify that machlokes as to what exactly it's about. The Gemara will say it's actually both machlokes, and it's a machlokes about the size of the sukkah and how a person arranges himself. Then the Gemara will discuss the minimum size that applies to every house, and all halachas of houses that we've seen. The Gemara will ask if that minimum size also qualifies for sukkah or if it's a different halacha, and the Gemara will specify and clarify each of those halachas. So first of all, what are the three potential sizes of minimum for a sukkah? So we know Rebbe's opinion is that it has to be 4 amos by 4 amos. That's clear in a few brises and mishnayos. Rebbe holds 4 amos by 4 amos. Now, the other two opinions come from two brises. One is just a Tanakama that argues on Rebbe and says it has to be big enough to hold a person's head, the majority of his body, when he's reclining, and his table. A different brisa also argues on Rebbe, and this one leaves the table out. It just says his head and the majority of his body. So Gemara wants to say that's the machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about the minimum size of a sukkah. Who's this Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai? So the Gemara says it refers to a different Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai discussing what happens in a specific case where somebody set himself up, his table was outside the sukkah, and he was inside the sukkah. So Beis Shammai says he's not Yaitza, Beis Hillel says he is Yaitza. So the Gemara wants to say that's the same machlokes, the same Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai as in those two brises that argued on Rebbe. Beis Shammai is saying you have to have room for your table in the sukkah, therefore he's not Yaitza. Beis Hillel is saying he doesn't need room for the table in the sukkah, therefore he is Yaitza. The Gemara says, well, this doesn't sound like a machlokes about the size of a sukkah. It sounds like a machlokes about whether a person's doing the mitzvah properly or not. And the issue is, are we afraid that if his table's outside the sukkah, he's going to end up with himself being outside the sukkah because he'll naturally flow to where his table is? And it's not a question of sukkah sizes. It's a question of how you did the mitzvah properly. So the Gemara says, but what do you mean? But it says the case was like this. This is the case. This is the case that happened. That sounds like it's a question of was he Yaitza in this case or not. It doesn't sound like it's a question of sukkah sizes. So Gemara says, but if it's not a question of sukkah sizes, then the language of the Mishnah should be Yaitza or not Yaitza. Did the mitzvah or didn't do the mitzvah? But that's not the language of the Mishnah. The language of the Mishnah is puzzle or not puzzle. Is that a kosher sukkah like that or not a kosher sukkah? That sounds like we're talking about a minimum size. We're talking about where the sukkah was too small to fit the table, and that's why Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are arguing over whether he's Yaitza in a sukkah like that. The reason the table is outside is because it's too small to fit the table into the sukkah over there. So the Gemara says actually Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai argue over both things. First of all, they argue over the minimum size. Beis Shammai says it has to be big enough to fit the table, and they also argue over if you have a nice big sukkah, but you left the table outside the sukkah, and you're sitting at the table. You're in the sukkah, and the table's outside the sukkah. Are you Yaitza or not? Or are we afraid you're going to go outside the sukkah because that's where your table is? Now the Gemara says that Shmuel bar Yitzchak paskin like Beis Shammai. Rabbi Abba questioned, do you really pass like Beis Shammai? He said, of course I am. Why not? A different version, he said, I'm passing like Beis Shammai straight out. Rabbi Abba asked who? He said, it's like Beis Shammai, and don't leave it, the halacha here is like Beis Shammai. You need to have space for the table in the sukkah itself. Now the Gemara brings a lengthy brisa, which discusses the halachos of various different things which require a house. And in all of these, it says it has to be 4 amos by 4 amos. The Gemara wants to know, does that only fit with Rebbe, who says that a minimum size house is 4 amos by 4 amos? So the Gemara says, no, before we see the list of what the Brisa spells out, the Gemara says, no, all these are talking about a permanent house. A permanent house, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai will agree has to be 4 amos. It's only a sukkah, which is a temporary house that they were saying could possibly be less than 4 amos. So a sukkah could be less than 4 amos, but everybody agrees to have the halacha of a permanent house needs to be 4 amos. Now let's see the things on the list here. So first of all, it says that if a room or a house does not have 4 amos by 4 amos, it is not chayav in a mezuzah. It is not chayav in a makkah, a fence, if it's high up. It does not require a fence around the edges, and it cannot become tamei with tzaras. Another halacha, The halacha is that if you sell a house that's part of a wall of a city, it belongs to whoever buys the house, and it does not go back with Yovel. If it's not a house, though, if it's a field that's part of the edge of a city, it does go back with Yovel. So this halacha of a house has to be 4 amas by 4 amas. Any house or a room that's less than 4 amas doesn't count as a house as far as this halacha. Now, the Gemara explains the reason for all these halachas is because the Torah, when it lists all these halachas, calls it a house, it says a bias. Less than 4 amas by 4 amas does not count as an actual house. It doesn't qualify for the word bias. Okay, now, the next few halachas that the Brisa list, it doesn't say bias there, but it has to be a place that is fitting to live in. And therefore, also, less than 4 amas per 4 amas doesn't qualify as a bias, it doesn't qualify as a place that's befitting to live in. So what are the other halachas over here? So, the Mishnah lists off that you do not have to make an Erev Chatzeris. Erev Chatzeris means you have a number of different courtyards, or you have a courtyard with a number of different houses that all open into the same courtyard. If all the people in those houses want to carry in that courtyard, they have to do an Erev Chatzeris. It means that they all take part ownership of a piece of bread and they store the bread in one of the houses. They always consider like they're all using the house that the bread is holding, because the bread is holding because the house is holding a piece of bread that they own. And therefore, they're all considered to be owners in that house, and it's all considered the entire yard. It's all considered to be part of that rishus of that house, and therefore they're all allowed to carry within it. It's not considered a bunch of different rishuyos within this yard. So you're only obligated to join the Erev if your house is 4 amas by 4 amas. If there's somebody who lives in this chutzner, who has a house in this chutzner, and his house is less than 4 amas by 4 amas, and he refuses to join the Erev, not a problem. He doesn't need to join the Erev because it doesn't count as a real living space. Now, just as houses that are joined in a chutzner need to make an Erev Chatzeris that all share a mavoy, there's courtyards that all share an alley, all have to make what's called a shitufei mevois. Now again, if you have a chutzner that does not have any other houses in it, besides for a house that is less than 4 amas by 4 amas, that chutzner doesn't have to join the shitufei mevois. There is no living space within that house. Now, where can you keep the bread that forms the Erev Chatzeris or the shituf mevois? So the Brisa says you can keep it. You can't keep it in a house that's too small. It has to be kept in a living space. So if it's less than 4 amas by 4 amas, you can't keep the Erev Chatzeris in there. Interestingly, though, you could keep the shituf mevois. Gemara explains why is that. Because the shitufei mevois does not have to be kept in a house. It just has to be kept in a chutzner. And this little tiny house is not worse than any chutzner. It's not worse than an open space of a chutzner itself. The Gemara brings a brisa that shows us the halacha. It's actually a Mishnah. The Mishnah says an Erev Chatzeris is put in the chutzner, and a shitufei mevois is put in the mavoi. The Gemara says, what? Erev Chatzeris is put in a chutzner? No, it's not. We have a different Mishnah that says the Erev Chatzeris cannot be put in a gatehouse or a portico or a porch. That's the veranda people use to access a number of apartments that all open onto the same upper level walkway. All these places you can't keep the Erev there. So how can you keep it in the chutzner? So the Gemara says no. Doesn't mean you can't keep the Erev in the chutzner. When we say to keep the Erev in the chutzner, we didn't mean in the chutzner itself. We meant in any of the houses that are part of the chutzner. And when we say you keep the shitufei mevois in the mavoi, we didn't mean in any of the houses of the mavoi. We meant you keep it in the chutzner that uses the mavoi, and therefore you can keep the shitufei mevois even in a tiny house because it's no worse than a chutzner. Now, next halacha that the Brisa says is that we know that there's something called the tchum of a town that is within 2,000 amas outside the town is considered to be part of the tchum. You can walk in that space on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Now, where do those 2,000 amas begin? From the edge of the city. What's the edge of the city? So that's 70 amas past the last house in the city, because the 70 amas is considered to be part of the karfev of the city itself. Now, if you have 70 amas, if you have houses within 70 amas of each other, that extends the city further and further and further. As a matter of fact, if you have two cities that are 140 amas away, and there's a house right between them, it joins them into one big city, because you don't have a 70 amas space without a house between them. So Gemara says that for this halacha, it has to be a house that people could live in, so it has to be a house 4 amas by 4 amas. Less than 4 amas doesn't count. Gemara says, interestingly, a tent, a little lean-to that people stay in when they're watching the fields, that does count for this halacha, because that at least serves the purpose for which it was designed. People could spend the night there. But a house is meant to be a permanent house, and a tiny house of less than 4 amas by 4 amas doesn't serve any purpose at all. Now, the last halacha that the Mishnah says is that if a house is less than 4 amos by 4 amos, then inheritors who inherit such a house don't divide it up. So it says that indicates that if it is 4 amos by 4 amos, they do divide it up. But that can't be, because we have a Mishnah that says that you don't divide up a house unless it has 4 amos for each inheritor. That means it got to be at least 8 amos by 4 amos. So you can get 4 by 4 for each inheritor. So the Gemara says no. Therefore, what we meant when we said you don't divide it up means it does not have din chalukah. What's din chalukah? So the Gemara explains. Let's say you have a courtyard with 4 houses opening into it, and it's bequeathed to 2 inheritors. So it could be that the situation may arise in which it won't be split 2 and 2, it might be split 3 and 1. Let's say 3 of the houses are very small and one house is much larger. So you split it up, one inheritor gets a big house and the other one gets 3 small houses. So now in the yard, one has 3 doors and one has 1 door. So how do you divide up the yard? How do you divide up the space of the yard? So it's a machlokas. Gemara says that according to Rav Huna, you divide up the yard by the number of doors you have. The ratio of the space of the yard is divided to the ratio of the doors that you have. The one who has 3 doors in the yard gets 3/4 of the yard, and the one that has 1 door gets 1/4 of the yard, because you need the the function of the yard is to serve as a walkway, as an entranceway to get to the doors. If you got more doors, you get more yard. That is Rav Huna's opinion. Rav Chisda argues, and Rav Chisda says, no, each doorway gets a minimum amount. It gets a length of 4 amos along the entire width of the doorway. That's the space that you need to service your doorway specifically. So the one who has 3 doorways will get 3 spaces of 4 by the width of the doorway in front of the each one in front of the doorway that he owns. Now, if the chutzner is larger and there's more space there, the rest of it is divided evenly. There's no reason to divide that in accordance with the doorways. Now, this halacha is only true if the doorways are serving a house that's at least 4 amos by 4 amos. If the doorways, each opinion, whichever it is, Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Rav Huna says a doorway gets you a percentage of the chutzner, and Rav Chisda says a doorway gets you a 4 amos space. That's only for doorways that serve a house that are at least 4 amos by 4 amos. If a house is smaller than that, it doesn't count. Why? Because you're not going to keep it. It's not going to stay. It's not a livable house. You're going to destroy it. And therefore, you don't need an entrance for it, and there's no din chalukah.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.